In the autumn of 1941, the world stood on a knife's edge. Fires raged across Europe as World War II reached its fever pitch. Though oceans separated the United States from the front lines, American cities pulsed with urgency, each echo of distant cannon fire reverberating across factory floors and shipyards. With every dawn, the U.S. Navy pressed forward, mobilizing a force capable of stemming the Axis tide, yet every solution revealed new peril, and beneath the surface, anxiety churned. That autumn, work had begun on a fleet of warships that would shape the future of naval warfare, the mighty Essex-class aircraft carriers. These towering, steel giants, bigger than anything previously attempted, grew in dry docks along the American coast, unshackled by the limits of interwar treaties. Yet as the riveting and welding echoed late into the night, no one could say exactly when these leviathans would be ready to meet a hungry world at war. Months, perhaps years, separated the urgent present from the distant promise of carrier supremacy. Across the globe, old worries refused to die. Pre-war planners had cautioned that, for all their promise, aircraft carriers remained vulnerable in the new realities of high-explosive warfare. Grim tidings from Europe gave weight to these fears. The Royal Navy, on paper still the world's largest, was battered by the cost of modern combat. The Imperial Japanese Navy fielded experienced crews and new hulls. Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku formed an instrument of raw power. The United States, though recently flush with Lexington, Saratoga, and Yorktown, proud ships famed for their agile squadrons, struggled to match the momentum of its adversaries. Other ships were newer but unproven. Hornet and Wasp, names that would ring through legend, had only just joined the American fleet. The British wielded illustrious, formidable, and indomitable carriers, names conjuring resilience born of necessity. But for every new warship welded together, others fell victim to the enemy's reach. Royal Navy carriers like Courageous, Glorious, and Ark Royal were lost in daring action or surprise attack, the darkness of the Mediterranean swallowing their courage whole. Even the ancient, training-worn Argus found itself drafted into convoy escort duty, pressed from marginal to essential with every desperate call for help. In Washington and Norfolk, whispers of panic edged into strategic discussion. Every carrier hull became not only more precious but more vulnerable as the theater of war expanded. Navy brass realized that their entire system for turning young men into carrier pilots depended on fragile, overcommit fleets. Once, the plan had been simple: teach new pilots on forgiving runways ashore, then send them out to finish their training atop crowded, combat-bound carriers, masters of timing and nerves. But how could this continue, with every carrier soon on the front line and none left behind for the perilous work of landing practice? Had the method ever truly accounted for the dangers? Losing half the carrier fleet before a single Essex prow cut through the Pacific would be an unthinkable calamity. There was talk of compromise. Maybe Ranger, judged unfit for the wild Pacific, could train aviators in the Atlantic. But even there, submarine prowlers grew bold, and no one doubted the reach of enemy torpedoes. Were Ranger to head for the west coast, it seemed likely only that the attacking submarine would trade flags, not tactics. It was in this crucible of dread and innovation that a daring solution emerged from an unlikely quarter. Commander R. F. Whitehead, a man more at home on the fresh waters of the Great Lakes than among the briny squadrons of the fleet, proposed something audacious: a floating training carrier on the vast blue expanse of Lake Michigan. In this vision, far from the threat of German wolf packs or Japanese airstrikes, the United States could build a school for its future aviators, a place where training could proceed unmolested, shielded by the continent's very geography. This inland carrier would need no guns, no layers of armor. No fear of death from above or below would dog its decks. If ever an enemy vessel reached its waters, the nation would have far greater problems than the inconvenience of a few grounded pilots. With the radios free from eavesdropping, instructors could test out the latest guidance technologies, fine-tuning their craft in the open without risk of enemy interception. Chicago, bursting with industry and home already to naval schools and a vast aviation mechanics center, stood ready as a logistical anchor, a city transformed into a cradle for the Navy's experiment. Pilots, more than likely to dent or mangle perfectly good airplanes during their first attempts at landing on a moving deck, would now do so above the ready hands of eager mechanics. Every crash, every misjudged bounce, became a lesson for both airman and wrench wielder. Broken, battered machines could be studied, repaired, and returned to battle, or consigned, in turn, as objects of engineering study, their wounds offering silent testament to a war fought as much in the classroom as above the waves. Nor would the Great Lakes narrative stop at safety. Their ferocious storms, jagged ice, and freezing winds forged a training ground as merciless as any Atlantic squall or Pacific gale. Here, hundreds of miles from the ocean, American pilots would learn to trust their skills under the cruel tutelage of nature, pushing through hail and icy gusts, bracing for each new and unpredictable test. The plan, perfect in its simplicity and logic, had but one catch: time. Before the Admiralty could formally approve Whitehead's proposal, history intervened with ruthless speed. On December 7, 1941, the rising sun delivered its infamous call at Pearl Harbor, and the United States plunged headlong into total war. Every available fleet carrier vanished from the training docket, called to service on rolling Pacific tides. Steel constraints asserted themselves. The Welland Canal, slim and shallow, made it impossible for any capital ship to steam upriver from New York or Boston. The largest American slipways, pressured by the demand for destroyers, cargo ships, and frigates, could not be spared for an inland experiment. If the Navy wanted a carrier on Lake Michigan, she would need to be cobbled together from the ships already on those unpredictable, inland seas. So began the hunt for a suitable donor, a vessel large and sturdy enough to bear a full-length flight deck, swift enough to keep pace with the winds. Each Great Lakes steamer and ferry was measured not just for length, but for its place in the coming fight, a strange selection, part engineering, part pragmatism, and wholly dictated by urgency and need. The making of the forgotten carriers had begun. From the bustling piers of Chicago to the frosty reaches of Lake Michigan, the story of the inland carriers took shape amid urgency, innovation, and a peculiar sense of hope. The Great Lakes, a watery frontier carved by ancient ice and bordered by restless cities, would become a secret theater in America's war effort, a place of transformation where raw recruits and discarded ships found new purpose. Commander R.F. Whitehead's plan was bolder than mere improvisation. It was a calculated bet on geography and ingenuity. He envisioned a floating aviator's laboratory, safeguarded by the surrounding heartland and untouchable by enemy bombers or prowling submarines. If a warship appeared on Lake Michigan, it would signal catastrophe on a continental scale. By then, pilot training would hardly matter. Such security granted unprecedented freedom. The carrier could function without torpedo defenses, heavy armor, or the constant shadow of armed escorts. New radio technologies, navigation beacons, and experimental landing aids could be tested in full without fear of interception. This was an environment in which tactical imagination could truly flourish, far from the lethal calculus of the high seas. Chicago, standing firm on the southwestern tip of Lake Michigan, was more than just convenient. It was a city sculpted for war. Two naval schools pulsed with activity, one focused on basic military training, the other, a sprawling aviation mechanics center, hummed with the methodical clatter of wrenches and engines. The interplay between pilots and mechanics became a kind of symbiotic exchange. Every mishap above the water meant another valuable lesson for the mechanics below. Aircraft broken in the pursuit of mastery didn't simply idle in hangars, they became subjects for urgent restoration, their battered frames fueling an endless cycle of repair, reuse, and refined expertise. Yet the challenges of inland training were not limited to logistics and equipment. Lake Michigan itself was a trial ground of unpredictable moods. Storms crashed with sudden violence, lashing the shoreline with towering waves and bitter hail, temperatures plunged, freezing decks and testing resolve. There were days when the water itself became an enemy, icing over and trapping ships miles from shore. In this climate, even mundane practice runs risk disaster. Trainee pilots, many just teenagers, braved real danger, not just from enemy fire, but from nature's unruly whims. The Great Lakes became a crucible, forging warriors who would soon face the Pacific's fury. Still, one vexing problem stood between Whitehead's vision and reality. The urgent approval from U.S. Navy brass came just as headlines screamed about the attack on Pearl Harbor, a day that turned abstract plans into immediate necessity. With war declared, every operational fleet carrier was dispatched to the world's oceans, leaving none available for inland experiments. Worse, the Welland Canal's narrow choke prevented the passage of any capital ship from the Atlantic to Lake Michigan. Every potential solution ran up against steel and stone, time and tide. Ingenuity, however, has always thrived under constraint. Large shipyards on the lakes were already pressed hard, contributing destroyers, sub-chasers, and merchant vessels to the war's insatiable appetite. Building an aircraft carrier from scratch would be impossible, there simply was no time, nor spare capacity, for an entirely new hull. But as American strategists surveyed their options, another path emerged: conversion. Escort carriers already dotting naval charts were frequently repurposed from merchant hulls. Inspired by this precedent, planners scoured the lakes for ships long and wide enough to bear a 500-foot flight deck and capable of maintaining a respectable turn of speed. It was a strangely pragmatic process, part scavenger hunt, part engineering riddle, all shadowed by the ticking clock of global conflict. The list quickly narrowed. Two vessels stood apart: the car ferry SS City of Midland, famous for transporting vehicles between lakeside railheads, and the sightseeing steamer SS Seeandbee, known for luxury and speed, but less vital to wartime logistics. Both ships sparked debate. The Seeandbee, a paddle-wheeler with twin wheels at her flanks, promised surprising stability and a roomy platform for takeoffs and landings. City of Midland, while practical and hard-working, was still essential for moving war material. The Seeandbee's age, built in the 1910s, meant concessions: her coal-fired engines required arduous labor, and her speed fell short of brisk ocean-going standards. But, in war, perfection is often the enemy of progress. Ultimately, the Navy moved decisively. In March 1942, Seeandbee was acquired for just over $250,000. The luxury vessel, as cherished by pre-war holidaymakers as she was ignored by wartime strategists, would soon find herself stripped of polished wood and fine fittings, her glamorous decks transformed into the hard, purpose-built surfaces of martial discipline. Wartime urgency lent a feverish pace to every task. As demolition crews worked to gut the old steamer, the carrier training program itself began to expand. New Essex-class hulls went under the torch, and Independence-class ships, converted light cruisers, joined the fray. Attrition rates among newly minted carrier pilots stunned Navy planners. In those first desperate months, deaths and disappearances combined with medical discharges to outpace the available pool of trained aviators. Every salvageable flight deck, every repurposed hull, became a lifeline. The need to train ever larger numbers of pilots grew almost exponential. This fervor led Navy engineers to embrace redundancy. One training carrier was a start, but why not two? With both vessels on the lake, weather delays, refueling stops, and maintenance interrupts could be offset. Formations of trainees would always have at least one deck ready for qualification, even as its twin rested. The pressure to locate a second usable ship became intense. Planners extended their search beyond the cash-strapped owners of Seeandbee, probing for other potential acquisitions among lakeside companies still turning reliable profits. Eventually, the brighter, newer SS Greater Buffalo, a steel paddle-wheeler designed after Seeandbee, entered the crosshairs. Faster and larger, also coal-fired, she would soon join her sister in a twin conversion, both destined for an extraordinary chapter in the annals of naval training. As sunset swept across Lake Michigan in late 1942, the transformation of these paddle-wheelers into floating classrooms began in earnest. Thousands of young men, and a handful of women, braced themselves for a journey into the unknown, their fates tied to ships once built for leisure, now charged with forging the next generation of carrier pilots. In the heart of America, cut off from the coasts and the relentless drumbeat of enemy guns, destiny turned inland, and the future of naval aviation waited just beyond the horizon. The dawn of December 7, 1941 forever split the world into before and after. As the sun rose over Pearl Harbor, the thundering arrival of war with Japan swept away all illusions of time or safety. Those reverberations shook every U.S. shipyard, every drafting table, and every quiet Midwestern lake where a radical idea was taking shape. Overnight, the plans for an inland carrier became more urgent than ever, but also tangled in the complex realities of a nation suddenly all in. Every fleet carrier, new or old, was snatched into service at a fever pitch. Ships once considered too old, too slow, or too experimental found themselves pressed into combat, scrambling for every edge in a fight now worldwide. The original proposal for a training carrier on Lake Michigan faced new obstacles. The dimensions of the Welland Canal, narrow and shallow, meant that not a single fleet carrier could be brought up from the Atlantic ports. Lake Michigan, a vast inland sea, was paradoxically cut off from the coasts by a choke of man-made stone. As the urgency mounted, planners realized they must turn to the ships already at hand, vessels built and berthed on the lakes themselves. Here, the local shipyards labored day and night to supply the war effort with a steady stream of smaller warships, sub-chasers, and merchant freighters. To set aside a slipway for a completely new carrier, they were told, was simply out of the question. Decades of industrial planning were being stretched to their breaking point by the demands pouring in from every front. But necessity, as always, drove innovation. American shipbuilders had recent experience in the conversion of merchant hulls into escort carriers, ships created out of urgency and improvisation. Could the same principle be applied to the Great Lakes? Planners combed through inventories with meticulous intent, scrutinizing each vessel for the holy trinity of desirable traits: length for a flight deck, enough speed to simulate carrier operations, and hull stability for safe landings. Every candidate was weighed not only as a technical solution, but also as a piece in the evolving logistics of war. Among the finalists stood two haunting choices: SS City of Midland, a car ferry vital for moving vehicles from the industrial heartland to East Coast ports, and the SS Seeandbee, a once luxurious sightseeing steamer turned idle by rationing and wartime austerity. Both ships had advantages. City of Midland was practical, essential, and still actively contributing to military supply lines. Seeandbee, while aging and no longer essential, possessed the sheer size and speed required, plus her design as a paddle-wheeler meant unusual side-mounted stability, reducing the risks of accident and carnage should a trainee pilot err catastrophically. Yet speed was still an issue. Seeandbee, built years before with comfort as a priority, peaked at less than 20 knots, not ideal, but given the constraints of location, resource scarcity, and the relentless ticking of the war clock, urgent improvisation superseded perfection. Her coal-fired engines, an echo of an earlier maritime age, became a reminder of the Navy's willingness to sacrifice ease for necessity. Someone, perhaps half resigned, joked that every shovel of coal on board Seeandbee was a nod to the old battleships, phased out but never forgotten. And so the U.S. Navy acquired Seeandbee in March 1942 for roughly $340,000, a bargain struck in the white-hot crucible of emergency. Demolition crews swiftly went to work, stripping away layers of ornamental wood and fine furniture, clearing the decks for steel, tension, and grit. Every hour spent unmaking the old steamer marked another step toward a floating classroom for air warriors. Meanwhile, the scale of the carrier pilot training program was ramped up to meet the catastrophic attrition rates the Navy now faced. New Essex-class carriers were being laid down, and Cleveland-class cruisers converted into Independence-class light carriers. Qualified carrier aviators were vanishing at alarming rates, whether killed in action, transported missing, or medically disqualified for injury. Every new batch of hopeful pilots thinned the ranks with a ruthless efficiency. Even as the escort carrier program gathered steam, offering more flight decks for qualification, the need for more skilled pilots pushed planners to expand not just horizontally, but with urgency and repetition. The arrival of another training ship seemed not just wise, but essential. If one ship needed to refuel or undergo repairs, another could press onward with training. Adverse weather, operational delays, and routine maintenance became manageable risks rather than existential threats to the training schedule. The logic was simple: redundancy was survival, and every missed opportunity meant another pilot less ready for the trials of war. Here, the Navy once again displayed its signature pragmatism. If a bargain could be struck with one set of shipowners, perhaps another could be found. The search widened to include ships owned by more financially secure companies, not just those struggling under wartime strain. This led to the SS Greater Buffalo, a vessel a decade younger and larger than Seeandbee, designed for a different era but still coal-fired and a side paddle-wheeler at heart. In a sequence driven by both fortune and necessity, the Greater Buffalo was acquired just days before Seeandbee finished her conversion. She was hurried to the same shipyard, an unremarkable but efficiently managed American firm, where her transformation would mirror that of her elder sister. The two ships, from distant corners of the lake, now united by a new mission, were about to embark on an extraordinary journey, from peacetime leisure to wartime training, from floating palaces to the heart of a new generation's preparation for battle. The fate of the inland carriers was sealed, not with fanfare, but with quiet resolve and the ceaseless work of thousands behind the scenes. For those who watched from the icy shorelines or dim-lit shipyards, every rivet and every plank marked the threshold to a world changed forever by war's relentless knocking. The bustling shipyards along Lake Michigan echoed with the clang of steel and the shouts of workers as one of the war's strangest transformations took shape. The SS Seeandbee, once the pride of the Midwest's vacationers, surrendered her elegant staterooms and walnut banisters to the relentless logic of wartime necessity. For her, the age of luxury cruises was over. In its place rose a monument to improvisation, a civilian steamer reborn as the USS Wolverine, the first coal-fired paddle-wheel aircraft carrier the world would know. Reconstruction began at a feverish pace. The shipbuilders stripped away years of lavish ornamentation and ripped out decks layered in plush carpet, exposing a cavernous hull and the bones of a new war machine. Workers rolled in fresh steel, laying out a wide, flat flight deck extending more than 560 feet from bow to stern, with a noticeable overhang that would become a defining silhouette. It wasn't as long as the famous Yorktown or Lexington-class fleet carriers, but compared to the smaller escort carriers marking Navy's expansion, Wolverine proved more than a match. To anchor the vessel's training authenticity, a small island was constructed on the starboard side, a cluster of steel and rivets signaling to rookie pilots that this practice was as close to reality as possible. From this bridge, trainers could direct their charges and simulate real carrier landings. The deck itself stood 26 feet above the water, a height that raised eyebrows but proved manageable. It covered the paddle wheels with a generous sponson, offering both protection for the fragile machinery and a forgiving buffer for eager, nervous aviators. Inside, the transformation was just as dramatic. The ship's airy public rooms gave way to functional crew quarters, spacious by Navy standards, however, and far removed from the cramped accommodations typically endured by sailors on ocean-going warships. Remarkably, Wolverine retained a feature almost unheard of for a carrier, a small cinema, originally built to entertain guests with newsreels and travelogues, now repurposed as an instructional hub where new pilots absorbed critical knowledge in the flickering light of black and white projection. Safety was paramount. The Navy rigged no fewer than 8 arrestor wires across the deck, alongside a specially designed barrier, to catch errant landings and prevent disastrous splashes into the cold waters below. When trainees failed to hook the right wire or misjudged their descent, these modifications often made the difference between a successful training run and a bruising dunk into Lake Michigan. The name Wolverine reflected both its location and the fierce spirit of the Michigan woods. It was a fitting moniker for a vessel dedicated to forging new warriors from raw ambition. Early trials, of course, tested more than just student pilots. The engineering crew, unfamiliar with the quirks of aging coal-fired boilers, struggled to maintain pressure and speed, sometimes shrouding the deck in thick, acrid smoke just as pilots needed every clear moment for precise approaches. These challenges, equal parts mechanical and psychological, bonded the crew tightly. After all, both teachers and students knew that their success meant survival for those destined for the Pacific. While Wolverine was nearing completion, the newly acquired SS Greater Buffalo, soon to be known as USS Sable, began her own radical transformation. Where Wolverine's flight deck was all wood, Sable's designers went a step further, laying out steel sections finished with 8 different types of experimental non-skid coatings. Bird's-eye photographs captured this innovation, random patchworks of color separating one test panel from another like a cryptic code. These differences weren't the result of fading paint but a science experiment, testing which surface treatments could best withstand the battering winds, rain, and sheer force of carrier operations. Just as winter closed in and work on Sable slowed, Wolverine pressed ahead. On August 12, 1942, the USS Wolverine emerged, fully commissioned and ready to shape the future of naval aviation. During those first months, she was Queen of the Lake, a lone monarch patrolling inland waters, a curious spectacle for anyone watching from the Chicago shoreline. Planning for operations ramped up at the nearby Naval Air Station Glenview. This base, always busy with new recruits and training schedules, adapted to the influx of carrier trainees by annexing additional runways at Orchard Place, now a Douglas aircraft plant, soon a hub for experimental Army planes, and eventually the site of O'Hare International Airport. Pilots scrambled for slots, dodged C-54 Sky Masters as they taxied and took to the skies, eyes wide at the sight of strange, captured enemy aircraft being probed by American engineers. The training regimen was relentless. Additional fields at Allendale and, briefly, Elgin were pressed into service as simulators, small rectangles painted to mimic a carrier deck, minus the movement and threat of a freezing swim. Only when a pilot mastered these dry runs would they earn the right to attempt a real landing on Wolverine, where success and error alike played out atop steel and unforgiving water. The cycle began, and soon Lake Michigan was filled with wildcats, dauntless, and trainee pilots all fighting nerves, wind, and gravity for mastery of the carrier deck. Every crash left behind a hulk for the mechanics school, every successful run added another bird to the growing flock of naval aviators. Over and over, broken planes were fished from the lakebed, sometimes dumped to clear the deck for new operations, but more often rescued and restored for another crack at airborne glory. As the autumn of 1942 deepened, Wolverine's legacy took root. She could not match the glamour of her ocean-bound sisters, but in the heartland, amid storm, ice, and human perseverance, she became a classroom for courage, daring, and the relentless will to survive. While Wolverine plied the autumn waters as the lone carrier classroom, the transformation of Greater Buffalo gathered momentum along the steel-gray piers, promising a new era for Lake Michigan's strange fleet. The conversion to USS Sable was both a technical marvel and a gamble, a bet on the future of naval innovation, undertaken at breakneck speed beneath the looming shadow of the war machine. Sable's design was ambitious. Engineers proposed a radical departure from Wolverine's wooden flight deck, instead outfitting her with a patchwork of steel panels coated in 8 varieties of experimental non-skid surfaces. Overhead photographs would show a brightly segmented flight deck, divided into rectangles and squares of subtly different shades, not due to weathering or haste, but as part of a calculated experiment to find the best footing for carrier pilots in rain, wind, and frantic landings. It was the first American warship to test so many deck surfaces at once, a tribute to the Navy's commitment to safety and innovation amid unpredictable conditions. The conversion itself unfolded beneath relentless deadlines. Shipyard crews worked through snow squalls and bitter winds, tearing out the Greater Buffalo's remnants of Belle Epoque luxury and forging spaces for aviation mechanics, instructors, and young men bracing for the dangers of aerial qualification. Sable's flight deck grew longer, nearly 560 feet, matching Wolverine and nearly rivaling the Independence-class light carriers newly converted from cruisers. Her coal-fired paddle-wheel engines, a relic of early 20th century engineering, promised stubborn reliability amid wartime constraints. But technical prowess was only one part of the story. The arrival of Sable in late spring 1943 raised the stakes for training operations. No longer would inclement weather, fuel stops, or sudden repairs stall the flow of young aviators through Lake Michigan's proving ground. With 2 carriers alternating duty, pilots could train 7 days a week in carefully paced rotations, one ship resting, the other schooling, always prepared to seize on clear skies and fair winds. The atmosphere aboard the twin carriers was intense and sometimes surreal. Trainees faced an endless cycle of takeoffs, landings, and hair-raising bolters, missed hooks that sent planes bouncing off the deck or tumbling into the lake. Deck crews, often drawn from the ranks of survivors of sunk Pacific carriers, infused the operations with a mix of professionalism and gallows humor. A lucky few would spend afternoons in Wolverine's vestigial cinema, watching instructional films, a brief reprieve from the physical and emotional ordeal that defined carrier qualification. From the start, Sable was more than a mirror image of Wolverine. She was a testbed for change, hosting not only pilots but also classified experiments and technological gambits. Photographs from the period show awkward, twin-engined attack drones lifted onto her deck, obscure and sometimes dubious prototypes, part of a secret Navy project that would yield some of the world's first unmanned aerial weapons. Every takeoff, every crash, every salvaged airplane became both a record of progress and a marker of war's relentless trial and error. As the program matured, the Great Lakes themselves became a miniature theater of naval aviation. The twin carriers carved wide arcs across open water, passing beneath skies darkened by squadrons of Wildcats and Dauntless. Support vessels, cranes, cabin cruisers, even a dedicated icebreaker, loomed nearby, ready to rescue pilots who misjudged their approach and splashed into freezing waves. Perhaps the strangest legacy of Sable and Wolverine was the impact they had on regional history. Chicago's runways, once sleepy refueling stops, became packed with Navy trainees and experimental aircraft. Orchard Place, a field attached to the Douglas Transport Plant, became the birthplace of O'Hare International Airport. The pilots who qualified aboard the two carriers, numbering in the thousands, would go on to fight over the far Pacific, some making history, others quietly returning to civilian life. All the while, the Great Lakes carriers preserved an air of loneliness, their solitude broken only by the shouts of deckhands, the echo of engines, and the ever-present pressure to deliver skilled aviators to a world waiting in fear and hope. With the commissioning of USS Sable, Lake Michigan's twin monarchs were poised to shape the outcome of the greatest naval war the world had ever known, turning leisure into labor, and old steel into the beating heart of courage for a desperate age. With the twin carriers USS Wolverine and USS Sable commanding the vast expanse of Lake Michigan, a new chapter in naval aviation training began in earnest. From the runways of Glenview Naval Air Station to the lakeside flight decks, an extraordinary community of young men stepped forward, driven by a mixture of fear, ambition, and the call of duty. These were the pilots of the inland sea, taught, tested, and tempered far from the thunder of battle, yet preparing for the most perilous missions the Pacific theater would demand. The training regimen was rigorous and relentless. Glenview, located just a short drive from Chicago's bustling city streets, became the hub for carrier-bound aviators. But the base soon outgrew its capacity. Orchard Place, adjacent to the Douglas Aircraft Manufacturing Plant, provided additional runways that were less congested. Pilots learned to weave their approaches between experimental aircraft and massive four-engine transport planes rolling out for test flights. Their eyes scanned anxiously for the subtle cues of carrier landing, a world away from the calm runways they had first known. Further afield, smaller fields such as Allendale and Elgin were enlisted as simulated carrier decks, their flat, painted surfaces offering a dry run where pilots could master the mechanics of landing without the immediate danger of water below. Here, the realities of carrier operation, rolling decks, tricky wind currents, and the danger of missing arrestor wires, were distilled into practice drills, fostering confidence and skill in a controlled setting. When pilots advanced to the real carriers, the stakes doubled. Landing on Wolverine or Sable meant contending with a moving flight deck sometimes awash with black smoke from the coal-fired boilers below. The thick clouds, swirling unpredictably, turned routine approaches into heart-pounding tests of nerve and precision. Mistakes were costly, missed arrestor wires sent planes skidding perilously across the deck or plunging into the cold lake below. Each crash was as much a lesson for the mechanics as for the trainees. The jubilant clang of hammer and wrench from the adjacent Naval Mechanics School marked life-saving repairs that carried battered aircraft back into the training loop. For many, this was their baptism under fire. A young pilot's first proper landing attempt on a carrier could be terrifying. The sight of a floating deck just 26 feet above water, unstable beneath their wheels, became a grim standard. Over 8 arrestor wires, a barrier system, and the vigilant eyes of instructors, they learned to fight their instincts and trust the fragile machinery beneath them. Each day, the skies over Lake Michigan filled with Wildcats, dauntless dive bombers, Avengers, and other aircraft critical to the Pacific War effort. The sight was both surreal and majestic, squadrons of trainee aviators circling, descending, sometimes struggling, but always learning. Occasionally, planes disappeared beneath the waves, swiftly but sadly joining the rugged underwater graveyard of Lake Michigan, a testament to the unforgiving nature of carrier aviation. Yet breaking aircraft was not the only challenge. Pilots had to adjust to the Midwest's wild weather, storms that whipped swift winds across open water, sudden hail showers, freezing temperatures, and sometimes all at once. Lake Michigan, far from the ocean's endless horizons, yet proved an unpredictable, merciless instructor. Chicago itself became a city transformed by the war effort. The presence of naval air stations, training schools, and the bustling activities on the lake shaped the local economy and culture. It was here that thousands of young men took their first faltering steps toward becoming the hardened aviators who would help turn the tide of the conflict in distant waters. Instructors warned that not every trainee would succeed. The rigorous process demanded 8 successful takeoffs and landings to qualify early on, rising to as many as 14 in later years. But for those who passed, the pride of earning their wings aboard one of the Great Lakes carriers was a badge of honor like no other. The carriers, for all their unusual origins, had become crucibles of courage and skill. In the face of harsh training and uncertain futures, the pilots of the inland sea readied themselves for the ultimate test, the sky over the Pacific, where the fate of the war would be decided. As the seasons shifted and Lake Michigan surrendered to winter's icy grip, the relentless pace of naval aviation training met its sternest challenge yet. The once bustling flight decks of USS Wolverine and USS Sable found themselves trapped beneath sheets of glistening ice, evidence of nature's uncompromising hand amid a war fought not just against man, but against the elements themselves. Mid-December 1942 marked a perilous chapter for the inland carriers. Lake Michigan's freezing waves transformed the vessel into a forlorn island, stranded some 5 miles offshore like a marooned sentinel frozen in time. The Wolverine, caught in this frozen grip, was immobilized, a latter-day Erebus, cut off from her home port and the hopeful pilots who depended on her. For several days, the crew weathered the chill, waiting for warmer currents to liberate their charge from the lake's frozen clasp. During this icy lull, the Navy faced a stark choice: halt operations or relocate. The decision came swiftly. The flight school temporarily relocated to California's more forgiving weather, where escort carriers like USS Long Island and USS Core hosted the pilots' continued training. But even in these sun-kissed ports, challenges persisted. The small Atlantic-based escort carriers rolled unpredictably with the ocean's rhythm, less stable than the inland paddle wheels, making precision landings of novice pilots a nerve-wracking ordeal. The costs were high. Despite the move to 2 carriers on the West Coast, qualification numbers dipped. Roughly 240 pilots earned their wings, fewer than the 287 trained during Wolverine's first Great Lakes season, and fuel, maintenance, and operational costs soared. Moreover, many early problems lingered. Radio silence still choked communication, risks from enemy submarines remained, and the turbulent dance of carrier landings continued to split success from disaster by mere inches. By March 1943, frost thawed and lessons learned at sea converged with those gained on the lakes. The Naval Air Training Unit returned to the familiar waters of Lake Michigan with renewed vigor and, this time, both Wolverine and Sable in tow. The twin carriers resumed their roles as floating classrooms and crucibles for burnt-off nerves, with support ships ready to ferry supplies, pilots, and damaged planes. The lighter Commerce, outfitted with a towering crane, played a crucial role, shuttling aircraft between shore and ship, salvaging broken planes before they sank, and reinforcing the lifeline between the training carriers and their home base. 2 swift cabin cruisers, the Lar and Paragon, patrolled near the carriers, vigilant guardians ready to fish pilots from the lake's icy depths when splash landings inevitably occurred. When Mother Nature tested the ships with brutal winters, an icebreaker was even drafted into service, plowing channels through frozen expanses to keep operations moving. Not even the brutal winter of 1944–45, which encased the lake over the horizon from shore, could stop the training initiative. Its determination symbolized America's refusal to let weather deter the forging of its next generation of naval aviators. A familiar routine soon emerged. Squadrons took off from nearby airfields at dawn, assembling in the cool morning air into tight formations. Leaders signaled to whichever carrier paddled out that day, weather, repairs, and schedule dictating whether Wolverine or Sable would shepherd the day's missions. Pilots launched one by one, aching for the challenge and aware of the risks beneath every approach. The carriers spent long days tracing arcs out of southern Lake Michigan, fighting steady winds that pushed sail and smoke alike. Each captain plotted courses into the prevailing northbound winds, ensuring the deck had enough airflow for safe landings, and essential because neither vessel could generate the speed necessary for flight without natural wind over deck. Crosswinds demanded tolerance and skill from pilots, but were often considered unsporting to throw at green newcomers. The ongoing dance of man, machine, and weather tested nerves and muscle alike. Every landing was a test of precision, poise, and luck. Pilots initially needed to complete 8 successful landings and takeoffs to qualify, a number that rose to 14 with the program's evolution. The originally modest forecast of 30 pilots qualified per day blossomed. After a year, both ships were certifying over 60 aviators daily. This growth proved vital to the war, as Pacific operations intensified, and carrier fleets expanded. Yet beneath the chaos and camaraderie lay the unspoken truth: for every pilot who made it, some never did. Crashed planes gathered in the lakebed, silent memorials to those who struggled against the unforgiving art of carrier aviation. Some aircraft ended their brief careers smashed beyond repair, others sank after being gently pushed off the deck to make room for new arrivals. A handful were salvaged, restored, and flown again, a testament to the mechanic's skill and war's relentless economy. Among those who successfully earned their wings aboard these inland giants was a young naval officer named George H.W. Bush. At just 18, he would go on to become one of the most famous graduates of the program, his first carrier qualification aboard USS Sable marking the start of a life that straddled history and legend. The winter trials of Lake Michigan stood in stark contrast to battlefront heroics, yet their impact was no less profound. In the frozen silence beneath the ice and snow, America's future carrier pilots endured a gauntlet of nature and machine, preparing in shadow for the daylight of war. As the harsh winter of 1943 slowly receded, the resilience and ingenuity of the inland carrier program proved its worth. The cold months had tested every aspect, from engine reliability to pilot endurance, yet both USS Wolverine and USS Sable were ready to return to active service with renewed strength and efficiency. Their revival marked a turning point, illustrating the critical importance of the Great Lakes as a training ground that could not be matched elsewhere, especially in wartime's frantic pace. Come March 17, 1943, Wolverine officially set sail again from her frozen haven, embarking on a renewed mission to shape the future of carrier aviation. With the addition of USS Sable, now a fully operational sister, the pair was poised to revolutionize training by providing continuous, realistic flight deck experience. The arrival of her twin also meant that the Navy could ramp up operations further, often operating both ships simultaneously, one testing new techniques, the other serving as a backup or reserve. The support infrastructure rapidly expanded. The Commerce, a dedicated cargo ship fitted with a towering crane, became a vital hub for shuttling aircraft, parts, and personnel between the shore and carriers. This allowed for quick repairs and the swift exchange of planes, crucial during the high-intensity training cycles. 2 small, swift cruisers, Lar and Paragon, took on the role of rescue and recovery vessels, fishing out pilots and damaged aircraft from the icy lake when splash landings turned into soggy failures. In the thick of winter's grip and even facing late snowstorms, the Navy's engineering crews pushed through, refining boiler management, improving fuel efficiency, and reducing the thick black smoke that initially hampered landings. Such operational improvements meant that as the spring and summer arrived, the air over Lake Michigan was filled with more than just aircraft. There was a renewed sense of purpose. The routine became a familiar rhythm. At dawn, squadrons would depart from nearby airfields, assembling into tight flight formations against the pink-orange dawn sky. They would then be directed to their assigned carrier, either Wolverine or Sable, by radio signals and signals from the shoreline. The pilots would approach with nerves taut but resolve firm, their minds fixed on the vital goal, mastering the art of landing on a moving, sometimes pitching, steel deck. The entire operation was a ballet of wind, water, and human skill. The craft could not generate enough speed on their own. Instead, the pilots relied on the prevailing winds, which were themselves a decisive factor in successful landings. Crosswinds, turbulent gusts, and the lake's unpredictable weather posed constant challenges, but gradually, the rookies grew more confident, executing complex sequences of takeoff and landings, day after day. In late 1943, the training numbers soared. The initial aim of qualifying 30 pilots a day grew to over 60, reflecting the escalating demand of the Pacific Campaign. These newly minted aviators were not just numbers, they were the backbone of America's island-hopping strategy, the frontline fighters in a global fight in which every young face carried the weight of victory or defeat. Among this sea of trainees was a young officer named George H.W. Bush, who at 18 years old earned his wings aboard USS Sable. His story, the beginning of a lifetime of service, began in these icy waters, where he learned his craft under the hardest conditions. His achievements, like those of many others, epitomized the spirit of the Great Lakes carriers, perseverance amid adversity. Even as the war threatened to tilt the balance in the Pacific with the relentless march of Japanese advances, the inland carriers stood as a testament to American ingenuity. They had started as a desperate, makeshift solution, an experiment rooted in necessity, and had become a vital part of the training pipeline, ensuring that the U.S. Navy would succeed in mastering the skies far from the stormy seas. In the icy silence of Lake Michigan, millions of miles from the front lines, the carriers quietly forged the pilots who would carry the fight to distant islands, helping turn the tide of the war. Through snow, ice, and relentless effort, Wolverine and Sable sealed their place in history as the hidden heroes of American victory. In the shadows of history, far from the roaring battles of the Pacific and the beaches of Normandy, a quiet force was shaping the outcome of World War II. The pilots trained aboard the USS Wolverine and USS Sable were the silent heroes, the future carrier airmen who would deliver decisive blows against Japan's expanding empire. Their stories, often overlooked, reveal a unique chapter of ingenuity, resilience, and daring on the most unlikely of front lines, the icy waters of Lake Michigan. Thousands of young men, many with no prior flying experience, arrived eager but uncertain on the shores of Chicago. Amid the hum of engines and the clang of deck crews, they embarked on a grueling journey. Among these was George H.W. Bush, whose early training on the inland carriers became a defining moment in his life. For many, the icy lakes represented the crucible where nerves were steadied and skills forged under the punishing eye of nature and necessity. Throughout this clandestine effort, pilots from the Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm also made their way to the Great Lakes, adding a layer of international cooperation to an already extraordinary story. These British aviators, flying Wildcat, Corsair, and later Hellcat fighters, gained invaluable experience, training that would prove vital in turning the tide in the Pacific. They, too, became part of this strange, submerged frontier, contributing their expertise and camaraderie to the American effort. The program was not solely about personnel. It was a complex web of experiments, innovations, and classified projects. USS Sable became a testing ground for the world's first unmanned attack drones, whose flight profiles sometimes challenged both engineers and pilots alike. These experimental aircraft, launched from the steel decks of the inland carriers, represented a turning point in warfare technology, a glimpse of the future that would extend well beyond the war. The human stories, of courage, error, and perseverance, fuel the enduring legacy of the inland carriers. Men who had learned to trust their instincts amid snowstorms and gale-force winds went on to serve across the vast reaches of the Pacific, many earning distinctions and medals for their bravery. But beyond individual heroics, there was a collective achievement, the creation of a new naval culture, forged not on the rolling seas, but in the icy silence beneath Lake Michigan's frozen surface. The ironic twist of fate is that these vessels, born of necessity and improvised from luxury and cargo ships, helped sustain the United States' dominance in carrier aviation during its most critical moments. Their contribution, 17,800 pilots qualified in total, was essential for the island-hopping campaigns that eventually led to Japan's surrender. When the war finally ended and peace returned, the fate of Wolverine and Sable was sealed. The Navy acknowledged their crucial role but faced the harsh reality of post-war austerity. Both ships were decommissioned in early November 1945 and offered back to their original owners. Once again, the grand vessels of the war's most secret training program faced the end of their fleeting careers, their decks silent amid the debris and rust of peace. Their story might have been forgotten, submerged beneath the weight of more glamorous battles, yet beneath Lake Michigan lie their wrecks, haunting relics of a time when ingenuity turned the seemingly impossible into the essential. The brave pilots, engineers, and mechanics who served aboard these submerged giants forged a legacy that quietly helped secure the freedom we enjoy today. And so, beneath the icy waters of the Great Lakes, the forgotten heroes lie in silent slumber, testament to a remarkable chapter where innovation met adversity, and history was made in the most unlikeliest of places. With the final echoes of World War II fading into history, the remarkable roles of USS Wolverine and USS Sable came to a solemn conclusion. Having qualified a staggering total of over 17,800 carrier pilots, these inland ships had not only answered an urgent wartime need, they had reshaped naval aviation training in ways previously unimagined. Their decks, once alive with the roar of engines and the adrenaline of young aviators, now fell silent, their mission complete. In a heartfelt letter, the Chief of Naval Air Operations Training paid tribute to the officers and crews of the Great Lakes carriers. He praised their unwavering spirit, teamwork, and resourcefulness, acknowledging that without their dedication, the high rates of carrier qualification, delivered safely and efficiently, would not have been possible. This formal recognition underscored the immense value these vessels brought to the war effort, a vital lifeline keeping the U.S. Navy strong amid global conflict. The post-war world, however, offered little space for the unconventional. Both Wolverine and Sable were decommissioned in early November 1945 and returned to their original owners, bound by contracts that anticipated their temporary wartime service. Yet, the cost of restoring these vessels to their former civilian grandeur was astronomical. Turning them back into luxury steamers or profitable car ferries seemed impractical, especially as commercial operators faced economic uncertainty in the aftermath of war. Creative proposals surfaced, imagining the spacious flight decks converted for peacetime uses, car ferries holding hundreds of vehicles or even floating nightclubs, gathering crowds on a dance floor stretching over 50,000 square feet. Yet these dreams came up against legal reality. No safety railings lined the edges, making the risk of accidents too great in social settings. Liability suits loomed, and without serious investment, these ideas fell into quiet oblivion. The final fate of the Wolverine and Sable was scrapping, inevitable and unsentimental. Sold in 1947 and 1948 respectively, the steel of their hulls was recycled into peacetime industry, their decks no longer sites of training but reclaimed pieces of a world at peace. Yet their stories did not end in the scrapyard. Beneath the waters of Lake Michigan, remnants of the carriers remain, silent testaments to their extraordinary chapter. Today, those remains are a haven for historians, divers, and aircraft recovery teams. The lake bed is dotted with the scattered skeletons of aircraft lost during training, 3 dozen recovered, many more resting in the cold depths, each a fragment of the story of a forgotten frontier of naval aviation. These tangible relics keep alive the memory of a time when America's resolve was tested not just on the open ocean, but in an inland sea far from the front lines. The legacy of the Wolverine and Sable endures, in the thousands of pilots who carried their training forward into battle, in the innovations tested on their decks, and in a story of resilience and ingenuity that defies expectations. Their silent yeast of steel and courage helped swell the might of America's carrier fleet, shaping history from a hidden harbor on Lake Michigan. In honoring the carriers and the men who sailed and flew from them, we remember a chapter where necessity gave birth to invention, and where the hidden heart of a war machine beat strong and true beneath the surface of history.